What are you telling me, Mandem? Let's get back into the HTML series. In this video, we're going to cover HTML text fundamentals. One of HTML's main purpose is to give text structure so that a browser can display a page the way the developer wants. By the end of this video, you'll learn how to mark up a basic page of text to give it meaning and structure. This includes paragraphs, headings, lists, emphasis, and quotations. Let's get into it. Most structured text consists of headings and paragraphs. For example, newspapers and magazines. Structured contents makes the reading experience easier and more enjoyable. In HTML, each paragraph has to be wrapped in a paragraph element. Each heading has to be wrapped in a heading element. Now there are 6 heading elements: H1, H2, H3, H4, H5, and H6. H1 represents the main heading, H2 represents subheadings, H3 represents sub-subheadings, and so on. Let's have a look at a book I'm currently reading as an example. So the H1 element represents the title of the book. The H2 elements represents the title for each chapter. And the H3 element represents the subsections of each chapter. As you can see here, deep work is the title of the book. The H2 is the titles of each chapter. And then H3 is the subsection. Now it's really up to you what the elements involved represent, as long as the hierarchy makes sense. You just need to bear in mind a few best practices as you create these structures. Now ideally you should have one H1 per page. This is the top level heading, and all others sit below it in the hierarchy. Now make sure you use the headings in the correct order in the hierarchy. Don't use H3 elements to represent subheadings and H2 elements to represent sub-subheadings. This doesn't make sense and will lead to weird results. Now from the 6 heading levels that you can use, you should aim to use no more than 3 per page, unless you feel it's super necessary. Documents with many levels become difficult to navigate. Now in this case, it is probably best to spread the content over multiple pages instead. Now you might be thinking, why do we need structure? Now to answer this question, let's look at this example that I've got. The starting point of a nice hummus recipe. Now you can access this and save it from my GitHub repo in the description so you can follow along. Now this document contains multiple pieces of content. They aren't marked up in any way, but they are separated with line breaks, as you can see here in the editor. However, when you open the browser, all you can see is one big chunk. Now this is because there are no elements to give the content structure, so the browser doesn't know what's a heading and what's a paragraph. Also, users looking at the page tend to scan quickly to find what they want. A lot of times just reading the headings to begin with. If they can't see anything useful within a few seconds, they'll likely get frustrated and just leave. Now search engines index your page by finding the contents of headings as important keywords for influencing the page's search rankings. Now without headings, your page will likely not do well in terms of SEO. Visually impaired people often don't read web pages, they listen to them. This is done through a software called a screen reader. Now this software provides an outline of the document by reading out the headings, allowing their users to find the information they need quickly. Now if the headings are not available, they will be forced to listen to the whole document read out loud. Now to style content with CSS or make it do interesting things with JavaScript, it helps having elements wrapping the element. To style content with CSS or make it do interesting things with JavaScript, it helps having elements wrapping the relevant content. So CSS and JavaScript can effectively target it. Basically, we need to give our content structure. A semantic element clearly describes its meaning to both the browser and the developer. We need to make sure we're using the correct elements, giving our content the correct meaning, function, or appearance. And in this context, the H1 element is also a semantic element, which gives the text it wraps around the role or meaning of a top-level heading of the page. Now by default, the browser will give it a large font size to make it look like a heading, although you could style it to look like anything you wanted using CSS. More importantly, its semantic value will be used in multiple ways. For example, by screen readers or search engines. On the other hand, we can make any element look like a top-level heading. Now this is a span element. It has no semantics. You use it to wrap around content when you want to apply CSS or JavaScript to it, without giving it any extra meaning. We've applied some inline CSS, so to change the font size, the margin, the display, and font weight. Since it has no semantic value, it will not give any benefits for accessibility or SEO. It's a good idea to use the relevant HTML element for the job. Now let's have a look at lists. On the web, we have 3 types of lists: unordered, ordered, and description. Unordered and ordered lists are very common, and we'll go through them in this video. Description lists are less common and we'll cover them in a future video on advanced text formatting. Now let's look at the hummus recipe that we looked at earlier. Now unordered lists are used to mark up lists of items for which the order of the items doesn't matter. Let's have a look at the ingredients here. So here you can see the H2, the heading for the ingredients, and here's the list items wrapped within an unordered list. So all unordered lists starts with a UL element, and each list item is wrapped with a list item, as you can see here, with LI. Now ordered lists are lists in which the order of the items do matter. Now let's take a look at the instructions of the recipe as an example. Now the markup structure is the same as for unordered lists, except that you have to wrap the list items in the OL element rather than the UL. Now here it follows the same structure as the OL element wraps all the individual list items. However, in the browser, this comes up numbered. Now it's perfectly okay to nest one list inside another one. You might want to have some sub-bullets sitting below a top-level bullet. Let's have a look at the second list from our recipe example. Since the last two bullets are very closely related to one another, it might make sense to nest them inside their own unordered list and put that list inside the current fourth bullet. Let me show you. So we can move these two LI elements up within here and close this unordered list. Now as you can see here, for the fourth ordered list item, it has two bullets within it. In human language, we often emphasize certain words to change the meaning of a sentence, and we often want to mark certain words as important or different in some way. HTML provides various semantic elements to allow us to mark up textual content with such effects. Now let's have a look at a few of the most common ones. When we want to add emphasis when speaking, we stress certain words, subtly changing the meaning of what we're saying. Now similarly, when writing, we tend to stress words by putting them in italics. In HTML, we use the emphasis element to mark this up. As well as making the document more interesting to read, they are recognized by screen readers, which can be configured to speak them in a different tone of voice. Now browsers style this as italic by default, but you shouldn't use this tag purely to get italic styling. Now to do that, you'd use a span element and some CSS, or perhaps an I element. So let's say if we wanted to change this, the word chunky here, as we can see, as is wrapped around in quotes. If we wanted to wrap this with the emphasis element, we'll just put EM at the beginning of the word, and use the closing tag. As you can see here, it's styled with italics. To emphasize important words, we tend to stress them in spoken language and bold them when writing. In HTML, we use the strong element to mark up such instances. As well as making the document more useful, these are recognized by screen readers, which, similar to the italics, can set them up to speak in a different tone of voice. Browsers style this as bold text by default, but you shouldn't use this tag purely to get bold styling. Now to do that, you can use a span element and use some CSS, or even use the bold element. You can nest strong and emphasis inside one another if you want. So let's say if we wanted to have process it for a long time as strong, however, the word longer in italics. We can wrap this element with the strong tag. So we wrap the whole part of this sentence in strong. Now as you can see here, this is all in bold. And let's say if we wanted to use the word longer surrounded by emphasis, we can do that here by wrapping it with the opening tag and the closing tag. So as we can see here, now the elements we've discussed so far have clear-cut associated semantics. The situation with the bold, italic, and underline elements is somewhat more complicated. They came about so people could write bold, italics, or underline text in an era when CSS was not supported very well. Now elements like this, which only affects the presentation and not semantics, are known as presentational elements, and should no longer be used as semantics is so important to accessibility and SEO. I'll show you them here. So we've got hello in bold, italic, and underline, and as you can see in the browser, they all apply that styling. However, semantically, this doesn't work the same as using the strong or italics in terms of screen readers and SEO. HTML5 redefined the bold, italics, and underline with new, somewhat confusing semantic roles. Now, here's the best rule you can remember. It's only appropriate to use these tags to convey a meaning traditionally conveyed with bold, italics, or underline when there isn't a more suitable element, and there usually is. try thinking whether the strong emphasis, mark, or span might be more appropriate. Let me show you how this will look. I'm just going to comment out what we have here. Now they look similar. Here we have hello wrapped in a strong element, emphasis, the mark element, as we can see here. To get the underline, we're now using a span element with a text decoration of underline. Now always keep an accessibility mindset, especially that is becoming more and more important when it comes to SEO and more accessibility users are using the web. The concept of italics isn't very helpful to people using screen readers or to people writing in other than the Latin alphabet. Now it's important to note that people strongly associate using underlines with hyperlinks. Therefore on the web, it's best to only underline links. Use text decoration of underline or the underline tag only when it seems appropriate. That's it for now. This video should have given you a good idea of how to start marking up text in HTML and introduce you to some of the most important elements in this area. There are a lot more semantic elements to cover, and we'll look at a lot more in our advanced text formatting video later on in the series. In the next video, we'll be looking in detail how to create hyperlinks, possibly the most important elements of the web.